Part 1 Morning Fog at Linate. There was another feeling that was hard to describe, as if the entire airport were operating in a state of blind but still moving. The baggage carts moved more slowly than usual, their tires screeching on the wet pavement. The dispatchers had to bend down to see the painted lines clearly, but the more they looked, the more they seemed to melt into the fog. In the offices, people kept wiping the windows dry, but after a few seconds, the white haze would cover the entire space again, like a fog slowly taking over. Some of the experienced pilots began to feel uneasy. They checked the taxiway maps, but each company had a different version, updated in different years, with inconsistent markings. One map said R5, another S4, and both led to the same area but in different directions. At 200 meters of visibility, it was just a nuisance. But at 50 meters like that morning, it was a death trap. In the control tower, controllers could hear the faint hum of engines in the distance, but couldn't pinpoint where they were. They just knew there was a plane moving somewhere in the fog. But whether it was the right taxiway or not, no one could say for sure. Linate had no ground radar, no navigation system to track every movement. All instructions were based on radio speech, and sometimes even a few seconds of silence was enough to lose sight of it. The whole airport was like a map with its lines erased, every line blurred, every direction blurred. And in that blur, a small plane was slowly drifting off the path it believed was right a small deviation, but one that led straight to the runway where an MD-87 was accelerating. In a few more minutes, the disaster would have been complete under the fog without anyone noticing. Part 2. The Lost Cessna. The Cessna continued to crawl, its cockpit windows fogged up, the pilots straining to see the dim patches on either side of the runway. Every few dozen meters, they had to bend down to check the airport map, a printed sheet so old that the taxiways almost overlapped. The symbols R5, S4, B1 seemed to dissolve in the thick fog, making navigation a guessing game. In a crucial moment, they saw a yellow sign appear phantom-like. The letters on the sign had almost disappeared. The first pilot, believing it was the entrance to Romeo 5, steered right. But it was a taxiway that acted as a dead end, a side street that had been altered years ago, but their maps had never been updated. The Cessna crossed that dangerous line with a single turn of the steering wheel. And then, before they could realize their mistake, the runway ahead opened up into an unnaturally wide space, empty, silent, and foreboding. It wasn't a holding point. It wasn't a taxiway. It was runway 36R, where the 130-pound MD-87 was preparing for its final approach before pushing full throttle. When the Cessna pilot called out, "Ground, we are holding position," their voices were calm, confident that they had arrived. But in the control tower, the controller heard only static. He glanced through the frosted white windows, nothing. No plane, no lights, no signs to confirm, just a wall of fog. In that moment, both sides thought everything was going according to plan. But in reality, one small plane was standing right in the path of death, and another was about to come at them with the full power of its two jet engines. In a few seconds, all those false signals would resonate into the most terrifying collision in Italian aviation history. Part 3. The MD-87 accelerates in the mist. The MD-87 shot like a blind arrow through the opaque corridors of Linate. At 70, 90, then 110 knots, the pilots could only hear the roar of the engines and feel the fuselage shake slightly with each step of power. Nothing unusual, no warning. Just a bad weather takeoff, something they had done hundreds of times in their careers. The cockpit was completely reliant on procedure, on the controller's confirmation, on the belief that the runway ahead must be clear. They could not have imagined that at that very moment, in a fog so thick it swallowed the landing lights, something was waiting for them still, invisible, and less than a half second away. The speed was increasing. The wind whipped against the fuselage, vibrating as if it were swirling in the fog. At about 120 knots, the captain glanced sharply to the right. Nothing but endless white space. The world outside had become an opaque wall. V1. The co-pilot called out unabortable takeoff speed. From this point on, they had to keep going, no matter what. And in the very moment the MD-87 crossed the V1 threshold, the plane began to emerge from the thickest fog, a dark strip ahead. The captain squinted. A low, irregular shape began to emerge from the fog, as if someone had lightly drawn it with a pencil. In a second, they would realize it was no reflection or mirage. It was the Cessna blocking the way. And the MD-87 was going too fast to stop. Part 4. The impact. The moment of impact was invisible to anyone, but everyone within a few hundred meters felt it like the ground had risen up under their feet. The thick fog was torn apart by the impact, creating a flash of white light that flashed for a moment, then turned a fiery orange as the Cessna's fuel instantly ignited. The MD-87's right wing sliced through the small plane's passenger compartment, sending a long trail of flames across the runway. In the MD-87 cockpit, the impact was so violent that the pilots had no time to process what had happened. The captain could only shout one word, "Stop." But the plane had already exceeded its physical limits to stop. Warning systems blared. Red lights flashed throughout the cockpit, but the right engine had swallowed the debris and turned into a twisted mass of metal, spewing sparks behind it like a torch. The force of the impact caused the MD-87 to lurch violently, then completely lose its balance. The large fuselage weighing nearly 60 tons slid across the runway, leaving a red trail of flames more than 300 meters long. Metal panels were torn off, screeching like screams. People living near the airport said they heard a roar like the sky was cracking. And then, a thick, acrid smell filled the air, the smell of burning jet fuel mixed with the cold morning mist. The MD-87 skidded sideways, its tail sweeping like a knife, and then hurtled toward Hangar 3, a sprawling warehouse where dozens of workers were working, oblivious to the massive fireball that was coming from the fog. In the next few seconds, the disaster would no longer be confined to the runway. It would be thrust into people, into buildings, into ordinary lives starting a Monday morning like any other, and all that would change with the next impact. Part 5. The hangar explosion. The flames were so intense that the entire inside of the hangar was lit up as if by the sun. In seconds, the fog that had blanketed the airport was ripped apart by the flames, creating a vertical column of red-orange light in the cold gray morning. The temperature soared almost immediately, causing the metal roof panels to explode with a bang from the rapid expansion. Inside, the employees unloading luggage heard a huge crash before they saw anything. Some said they only heard a whirling sound, and then the entire front door was crushed like foil. When they turned around, the entire door was engulfed in a sea of red flames. They had only a few seconds to choose between their instincts: run or die. The metal luggage carts, which contained many flammable materials such as rubber and grease, quickly turned into moving masses of fire, rolling and burning fiercely. The luggage containers exploded one by one, throwing up debris like inverted fireworks. The ceiling lights in the warehouse short-circuited, sending blue sparks into the swirling black smoke. The smoke was so thick that people inside could no longer distinguish between the door and the wall. Some employees ran in the wrong direction and were stopped by the hundreds of degrees of heat at the end of the warehouse. The luckier ones found a back way, barely escaping before the roof began to collapse in chunks. The explosive force of the MD-87 fuel was so powerful that it shook the entire terminal building nearby. Many passengers in the terminal thought a bomb had gone off in the airport. Windows shook, fire alarms blared everywhere, and black smoke billowed from the hangar like a column of volcanic ash, obscuring the sky above. What happened in Hangar 3 lasted only a few dozen seconds, but it was enough to turn a foggy morning into a fiery hell for Linate. The disaster was no longer a collision between two planes, but a full-blown fire and explosion, engulfing people and structures for hundreds of meters. Part 6: Smoke, Fog, and So's Calls. The first people to rush into the scene had to walk almost blindly. They ran with their hands out in front of them to avoid hitting the red-hot metal and burning debris that littered the ground. The intercom system was jammed with too many signals, forcing the rescue teams to shout to each other through their masks and the howling wind. Each time they tried to shine their flashlights through the smoke, the beams of their flashlights created a short beam, swallowed up as if the air had thickened into a wall. SOS calls from different points in the airport were heard. "There's someone in the hangar! Another explosion to the west! We've lost contact with Team 2. No one knew exactly how much damage there was. No one knew how many people were trapped in the MD-87 or in the hangar. They just had to run to the biggest fire, follow their instincts through the chaos of sound and smoke. As they approached the main body of the MD-87, the fire crew saw shattered windows, the rubber trim running in black streams down the fuselage. The temperature nearby was so high that even the special protective suits could not withstand it for long. They tried to break open the emergency exits, but the metal expanded due to the heat, causing all the joints to jam. Some passengers were unconscious on the spot from the initial impact. The rest were consumed by toxic smoke and fire within tens of seconds. A few meters away, the rescue team spotted the wreckage of the Cessna, but it was just a pile of crushed, charred metal, no longer resembling an airplane. It had all happened so fast, so violently, so brutally. Not a soul aboard the small plane had time to make one last radio call. And as the rescue teams began to pull the water hoses into place, they realized the chilling truth. Not only had the two planes gone, but a hangar, a work area, and half the airport had been transformed into a maze of fire, smoke, explosions, and faint cries for help in the absolute chaos of the morning. Part 7: The Investigation in the Fog. Investigators had to reconstruct the entire incident using fragmentary data. A few broken radio signals, blurred tire tracks on the wet runway, pieces of metal scattered hundreds of meters away, and black box recordings distorted by wind and engine noise. They reviewed every communication tape, every taxiway map from each airline, and discovered an even more frightening truth. Linate had too many versions of the map, each with its own drawing, each with its own markings, and none of them accurately reflected the old, patched-up taxiway over the years. In the same investigation, it was discovered that the correct taxiway sign was placed several meters off, and the wrong taxiway sign was too close to the turnoff, making it entirely possible for a pilot in foggy conditions to choose the wrong one. The yellow and black signs, faded from time and weather, were not replaced despite repeated warnings. Controllers could not see out the windows, but records show they had no tools other than paper maps and radios. No radar, no ground surveillance, no taxiway crossing warnings. The control room even lacked a crucial part: the procedure for closing the runway when visibility drops below safe levels, which most major airports strictly enforce. Linate chose to continue operating, albeit with eyes closed. When investigators recreated the Cessna's path that morning, they realized something horrifying. The small plane had not made any obvious mistake. It had simply done what the pilot thought was right based on a fundamentally flawed system. Meanwhile, the controllers followed the procedure to the best of their ability, but in a room where they had never seen the Cessna move. A member of the investigation committee said something that silenced the room. "We cannot expect perfect people in a system that has been left to rot." And that was the final conclusion. This was not the fault of a single pilot, controller, or decision. This was a collective failure, A long chain of omissions, neglects, delays, and disregard for safety building up over years, waiting for one foggy morning to explode. Part 8. Systemic Flaws. The report also found that many of the earlier warnings were not only ignored but dismissed as non-urgent, a chilling phrase that contributed to the deaths of 118 people. Engineers had proposed closing some of the old taxiways, including R6, because they were too confusing in bad weather. But concerns about disruption and repair costs pushed those recommendations aside. Linate operated on a patch where the leak is most likely basis, rather than a truly safe system. The investigators also discovered something chilling. The airport had never practiced extreme fog, even though northern Italy experiences dozens of such days each year. There were no contingency plans, no plans to freeze ground operations, no procedures for prioritizing communications in near-zero visibility. A major European airport operated as if any unforeseen circumstances would get out of the way. Even the training of ground staff was severely lacking. Many young staff did not fully understand the old taxiway conventions, which themselves were constantly changing and not updated in a synchronized manner. Some controllers admitted that they were also confused by the taxiway diagrams, because the version in the control room was not the same as the one used by the airlines. All these flaws, on their own, would not have caused the accident. But when combined dense fog, inconsistent maps, blurred signs, lack of ground radar, an abandoned taxiway still open, and the false confidence that everything still worked, the seemingly solid safety system collapsed in a matter of minutes. After the disaster, Italy was forced to change from the foundation, installing ASMGCS ground radar, revising the entire taxiway design, permanently closing R6, replacing the signs to ICAO standards, retraining controllers, and establishing operating procedures for low visibility. These changes were implemented so quickly that many people say if they had done it earlier, 118 people would not have died. And in all the documents, signs, and new systems that were put in place after the accident, there is always an invisible figure standing behind. The last minutes of that foggy morning at Linate, a painful lesson that made all of Europe reconsider how they treat aviation safety. Part 9. The Legacy of the Fog. The memorial is not large, but anyone who has ever set foot there feels a very different kind of silence. The silence of memory, of a belated apology. The flat white stones, as cold as the morning of the accident, stand in rows like the shadows of people who will never return. Each name carved into the stone is an unfinished story, a business trip, a family returning from vacation, an employee starting the first shift of the week. When fog descended on the garden, a common occurrence in Milan, the memorial was almost entirely white and gray, with only the bouquets of flowers providing a fragile color. The dead could no longer speak, but their names whispered in the wind, a reminder that even safety systems have their limits if people fall asleep in complacency. Many airport workers who have moved on or retired still return to the site each year. One former ground technician said he could not forget the feeling of hearing the explosion and not knowing where it came from because the smoke and fog were so thick you couldn't see the ground. He placed a flower on the stone and whispered, "We were blind not just because of the weather." Today, every time a pilot taxis into fog, every time a tiny dot of light flashes on the ASMGCS ground radar, and every time a controller sees every movement under their wings with meter-level accuracy, people know that the system was built not from theory or international standards, but from a cold morning that claimed 118 lives. The dots on the radar screen are therefore more than just technical signals. They are a reminder. The clarity of the sky is less important than the sanity of the people. And that is exactly what Linate's legacy is, a painful memory, but one that will ensure that European aviation never goes blind again.